Hello, everybody, and welcome to our community meeting. I was planning to give just a quick overview of the meeting tonight and the status of the study and how the meeting will work. And then I was going to turn the presentation over to the representatives from Matrix that are present tonight. The study of the police department was in 3 phases, and we named them appropriately 1, 2, and 3. And 1 and 2 have been completed, 3 has not. By the way, both 1 and 2 have been on the website for some period of time, so you can see what they both are and review them if you like at your own on your own time or your own as long as you'd like. The phase 1 study was a study of largely of the current police department. There were recommendations of both staff and operations of the current police department in the phase 1 study. That study also covered crime trends, types of incidents, calls for service, and something called proactivity in terms of what the police department does and how it works with total available time. In terms of service delivery, it covered such topics as recruitment, retention, below market salary, officer safety, sufficient supervision, management, equipment. And it also included a section on best practices in both staffing and operations in the industry and compared the best practices to what is currently taking place in Kensington. And there was also a community questionnaire that probably many of you participated in, and there was a summary of that questionnaire included in the phase 1 study. The phase 2 study, which was in draft form, is a feasibility analysis of contracting the police services. And in that study, the Matrix people contacted 3 cities on their interest on contracting. Berkeley did not respond. Albany said they weren't interested at this time. And El Cerrito indicated they have some reservations, but they're open to a contract. So, as expected, it's a variable process. Some cities are going through transitions, and they're not interested when they're going through a transition. Those that maybe are a little bit more established do have some interest or openness to contracting. So if we did the same survey in 3 years or 5 years, the answers from the 3 cities could be different. The phase 2 also does an extensive financial analysis that compares a revised in-house department, revised based on their matrix recommendations, what it would cost to contract, which is an estimate, and compared those 2 options to the current operation, how many officers we have and what the costs are for the current operation. Phase 2 also studied staffing and workload and concluded that Kensington should have 11 total positions in the police department. Sworn positions. It also talked about what's important to the community. What are the guidelines that govern this analysis that are important to the community based on the survey feedback, talking to citizens, and other information that was garnered with both talking to the staff and other community members. They also estimated the cost of a sample contract. We don't have a contract, but they estimated the cost of that in their analysis. And there was also an analysis of CalPERS retirement costs and options. So that's a major cost factor in looking at these options. There are different ways of proceeding with CalPERS, and their analysis shows a comparison of those options. And in this process, they developed something called a hybrid model, which is not contracting and not completely keeping the Kensington department. It's contracting some aspects of the department. So it's a hybrid model, and they can talk about that in a little more detail. That I've gotten quite a few questions about what does that mean and how does that work. We hope to answer that tonight for you. So, so what are the next steps? The next steps after reviewing this information is to bring this information to the Board of Directors, hopefully in March, if not by April. And the board then would consider this information and decide what course to follow, whether go ahead and do this phase 3, which is explore the contracting costs, or not do it, or to do the hybrid, or what options they would like to get more information on. And by the way, phase 3 is not to contract, it's only to get financial information. There's no decision to contract, it's just get actual contract information. At this point, it appears only one city would be interested in responding. There was also some funding issues that you'll see in this report, that these options all cost more than what the current department, what is currently funded. So there's questions about how to fund these options. The department that's recommended by Matrix and the actual cost of contracting are all higher. And so where are the funds going to come from, and how's that going to be financed is an important question that isn't really answered tonight. It's just the information is only presented. I considered using a question and answer format at the end where we had cards and you can submit questions, but I was approached by nearly everybody in the room who prefers to speak. So we'll go ahead and use the microphones, but I do ask your assistance in keeping your questions to below 5 minutes. We're not looking for speeches here or endorsements of any position. Really, we're looking for questions. The real decision process will occur before the Board of Directors, and that's the time. Those are the people that will make the decisions, and that's the time to express your opinions in particular. So I do ask your help in using this forum as a Q&A period on questions on these reports, and also in courtesy to those attending the meeting. Matrix has done 350 or more of these types of studies in police departments throughout the country. So they're very versed, and we gave them a free hand to develop their recommendations. What are the professionals who study other departments, who know other departments, what do they recommend for Kensington, given what Kensington wants and what the community wants? So they developed this, their approach based on that information. And we have two of the Matrix principals with us today, Mr. Richard Brady, who is the president of the company, and Mr. Greg Matthews. And I probably, they're going to repeat some of this information that I've summarized, but I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to them right now.
I am Richard Brady, and I want to thank Tony for giving 40% of our presentation tonight. We'll try to fill in the details. So this is the 5th time I think we've gotten together in either a town hall meeting or a board presentation that attracted a lot of interest, and we spent a couple of hours each one of those times getting input on police services as they exist at present, and input on some of the service delivery alternatives that were the focus of this study. So it's good to be here again, but it's been over a year that we've been doing this, so I thought it would be a good idea to go back and make sure we remind everybody what the structure of the study was, as Tony reminded us as well, and sort of build up from there in terms of what we've come up with in this phase 1 and phase 2 report. As Tony mentioned, there were two phases within our current scope of work. The first one is essentially examining existing police services in terms of, importantly, understanding the community desires, community values that need to be reflected in its law enforcement services. And we did that through the community survey as well as through the various public meetings that we had. The next part was really a management, staffing, and operations study of your current police services in terms of its staffing, in terms of its management, first-line supervision, the training that people receive, the policies and procedures, and the like. And that is just like the other 350 studies we've done for law enforcement agencies around the country. An important bridge to the second phase is development of service standards, service delivery standards, best practice standards that could be used in the future to evaluate or to make changes in existing police services as they currently exist in an in-house provided police service, or to look at a shared service or an alternative service provider with one or more of your neighbors. So in phase two then, which looked at these alternatives, there were 4 phases. Importantly, with community input, developed the service delivery assumptions by which we developed the analysis of how law enforcement services would be structured and the service levels behind them and what they would cost. We also identified potential contracting partners, and the community meeting, one of the community meetings, came up with an important assumption that we used in that we'll talk about, and that was the importance of having a contiguous neighbor as a contracting entity rather than opening it up to somebody further afield. We also identified the costs and looked at the cost effectiveness of various alternatives, as Greg will explain, either the full service alternatives or various what we're calling hybrid, which are shared services of individual services, whether it's administration or investigations or covering certain hours of the day and the like. And then finally, to come up with next steps for you, our analysis of best steps based on that. We've presented the draft reports for both phase 1 and phase 2 before. So what we're presenting here tonight are the final versions of those. There are some changes that we'll talk about, mostly expanding some of the hybrid, the individual functional ideas, but some other changes once other facts came to light. So that's what we're presenting, the edited final versions of this. So looked at another way, the scope of work was, as Tony mentioned, an independent and objective and fact-based look at current service delivery and alternatives to evaluate current services and look at what are appropriate staffing levels, what are appropriate management and supervisory principles, training, and everything associated with being a modern law enforcement agency in terms of equipment, in terms of policies and procedures, management systems, and the like. To contact, and we did contact, your immediate neighbors to look at their, to examine their interest in providing contract services in a variety of ways, and some preliminary discussions with them about how they would deliver those services on a contractual basis, subject to our analysis and the community's design of what those services would look at. And then we developed the analysis of cost and compared them to current service provision. So as I mentioned, the community input was a really important part of this. Early on in the project, a year ago, almost exactly, we got in at a Saturday morning town hall style meeting to get your input on existing service delivery from your from police services right now. And it strayed a little bit. I remember there was a lively meeting, but I think what was important for us there is that it identified some really important things that were important to the community, especially in terms of having presence, in terms of being community engaged, in terms of using proactive time to be, and we'll explain that a little more later, their available time to be on top of traffic concerns and be involved with the schools, but to be a modern professional service in terms of how well they're trained, how well they're led and supervised, and as well as how they're equipped. An important set of considerations for evaluating existing services as well as the alternatives was the need to have presence here, and I mentioned that a second ago. That you wanted 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, presence here in Kensington, and that Kensington in the contract service alternatives would not be viewed as an extension of a beat in another city, that it would be its own deployment entity, that it would be staffed by sworn officers around the clock, not civilians, not some other kind of remote method, but a traditional police service, which we looked at in these various alternatives, either internally based or in terms of contract services. So as I mentioned also a second ago, the importance of adjacency was critical in the design of these alternatives, and as a result, we didn't talk to other cities in the county besides your immediate neighbors. We didn't even talk to Richmond because while they share a border, you can't use a road to really get there easily. So we all along were focusing on El Cerrito, Albany, and Berkeley, and Greg will explain the results of those things. And there's some important reasons for adjacency. One is the immediate response, not just as a primary responder, but serious calls need more than one officer, need specialized resources, and you expect in a community to have that it wants high service levels to get that kind of assistance back up and special resources quickly, within 5 or 10 minutes at the most, and not have to wait a half an hour for a remote entity 20 miles away to come here. And that included evaluation or our decision not to evaluate the sheriff's office. The sheriff here does not have any service station existing that's in the immediate vicinity, and so they'd have to create an entire force here, which they wouldn't do, or be served remotely as other cities would have to do within the county. So let's talk a little bit about what we found in phase 1 of the study in terms of current service delivery and our findings, which set the stage for looking at staffing alternatives, management alternatives, different approaches for staffing and equipment, your police force, as well as, I think, hopefully, at least having you be open or receptive to the idea of looking at other kinds of alternatives. First and foremost, Kensington has chronic staffing shortages. There are many hours a week where there's only one officer deployed. And the workload doesn't occur at such a level where there are often concurrent calls, but for serious calls, you need a second officer, not just to handle the call, but also for supervisory purposes. Supervision in any line of work is critical. And in law enforcement, it's not unlike any other type of service, but because people's lives are at stake, it's really, really important. And that's why effective first-line supervision is a critical focus within any law enforcement agency. You are not staffing in any kind of interpretation of best practices right now, and it's not safe. It's not safe for the officers. Depending on the event, it's not safe for the citizens. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some of them relate to recruitment and retention. I should say that that is an issue for almost every law enforcement agency around the country. There are issues that make that more difficult here. Your compensation structure, certainly your salary structure, is lower to much lower than the other agencies in not just your immediate area, but the region. So the ability to attract and retain employees, especially younger employees, is definitely impacted by compensation. Your benefit package is quite good, and that's a countervailing factor, but many people look at the cash value and aren't looking longer term for health and retirement types of issues. But that wasn't the only issue that we came up with. There's the supervision issue is significant. So at present, you don't have significant supervision to be around the clock. Often the chief is providing that supervision, and he's doing that detracting from other things that a chief has to do in a 10-person police department, the same as in a 100-person police department. part of the supervision is not just some of the things relating to safety of the officers and the community and making sure that officers are acting in an ethical way, but just on a day-to-day basis, one of our key findings was that officers have a large amount of time to do proactive types of things. By that we mean community engagement, working with community groups, including the schools, working traffic where people are speeding down Arlington or in other streets within the community. And proactivity occurs at really low levels here. If they're not responding to calls, they're not generating other activity at a substantial level, and they're not working with the community. And that is an issue. Training that officers receive here is difficult when you've only got one person on duty and you don't have the resources to send somebody away on an overtime basis at the level that they need. The level of training here is lower than all of your neighbors. It's lower than best practice, and that's an issue. Lack of equipment to be efficient or effective. Body-worn cameras for transparency purposes and other equipment are now staples of the law enforcement industry and are a very important part of the practice. So those are major issues, and I think these major issues set the stage for our analysis, but also for you to have to make a decision. The status quo is not sufficient here. You're increasing your risks about lack of staffing, lack of management, lack of depth in training, lack of oversight. And by doing some of the things that we'll recommend, that we have recommended, that Greg will talk about in a second, you can reduce those risks. But of course, as with most things in life, reducing risks and paying attention to things like that costs more money. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg, and he'll get into more detail about our phase 1 and phase 2 recommendations.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is Greg Matthews. I'm a senior manager with Matrix Consulting Group. I am the meat in the sandwich. Rich will wrap up, but I will give you some details in the middle. And as Rich suggested, this is our 5th meeting with you all. Fundamentally, we've been talking amongst ourselves and the project team, how can we distill for you 110 pages in 2 reports, hundreds of survey instrument responses, dozens and dozens of emails that we got from you, so that we can all think about this in perhaps the easiest fashion. So as Rich mentioned, you have some decisions to make as a community, and we have distilled these down fundamentally into 3 key decisions that you have to make. And I'm going to give you, over the next 3 slides, a broad overview, and then I'll drive into some details in subsequent slides. But let's talk about what key decision number 1 is. Yeah. Oh. So we can, I'll tell a joke here, I guess, when we have in focus collaboration that works. Do that. Oh, there we go. So that's 2 slides beyond where we need to be. There we go. Yeah, keep that. That would be helpful. So, yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Otherwise, I'd be talking and people would be going, what are you talking about? So key decision number 1. Does Kensington want to have an enhanced and best practices in-house police department? That's your first major community decision. As Rich suggested to you, and as was shown in a prior slide, based on some of these community meetings that we had, based on the emails that we received, based on the survey instrument, it was made very clear to us that you wanted a highly trained, highly professional police department that provided quality service delivery. So that is effectively synonymous with developing a police department that is best in class. So what does that look like? Rich has already mentioned some of these. Tony has already mentioned some of these. It requires more field supervision than you presently have. It requires 2 sworn field personnel on a 24/7 basis. We'll talk about that a little more in a subsequent slide. It requires additional training and additional equipment beyond what you presently have. It ideally requires a more competitive salary to attract and retain qualified applicants. Now, as Rich also mentioned, if you want a best-in-class police department, you got to pay the piper. The bottom line is best-in-class, anything costs more money than average or below average. Next slide, please. So key decision number 2 then is, instead of potentially having a best-in-class police department, do you wish to develop a request for proposal to explore with one of your neighbors a full law enforcement contract for service model and basically obtain cost commitments from those potential partners based on that RFP? As I mentioned before, there are 3 potential partners: Berkeley, El Cerrito, and Albany. Tony already suggested some of the outcomes of that contact. I'll get into it a little more in a future slide. One of the things that is particularly noted here is if you did go to a contract, whether it's a hybrid or a full services contract, it's our point of view that those staff would be deployed from your police building here. They'd be managed out of that police building. They'd be deployed from that police building as opposed to their own home facility. And there are some advantages compared to in-house operations. One of the advantages is, as you suffer absenteeism here in-house due to turnover, due to other things such as absenteeism, vacancies, et cetera, in a full contract for service, you're always going to have the people because they're mandated to be there. It might not be Officer Matthews that shows up because Officer Matthews might be on vacation, but Officer Brady will show up instead. So one of the other important things that can occur in this environment that you would additionally get is dedicated resources for investigations, records, and other types of services. Just like a best-in-class police department, a full-service contract with one of your partners is very likely going to be more expensive than the existing in-house operations. Next slide, please. One of the things that came out of our efforts between the original draft of Phase 2 and the final Phase 2 report is there were additional questions and an additional desire for further feedback on what we would call a hybrid contract for service delivery model. So your third key decision is, does Kensington want to develop a request for proposal to explore a hybrid contract for service delivery and also obtain those related costs? Same partners, you're joining Berkeley, El Cerrito, and Albany. Now, there are potentially innumerable options for a hybrid model. By example, you can have an in-house police department that provides daytime patrol, and you can contract out for nighttime services. That would be considered a hybrid. You can have an in-house police department fully on both shifts, and you can contract out detective services to a potential partner. So there are a number of hybrid models that could be considered. What this allows you to do, it allows the community to do, is essentially customize your police services with a combination of in-house police department services as well as contract police department services to best meet your community needs. Now, dependent upon the kind of hybrid that you might develop, that could be more expensive than existing services. That could be more expensive potentially than, as I suggested, services. And it can also be less expensive than services, as well as the alternatives that we've recommended. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So getting into some of the details. What does an enhanced in-house police department look like? What are the details of that? Well, as we already suggested, you'd need 2 sworn staff on duty at all times. One of them would be a supervisor. This requires a reformulation of your staffing model. That would be a chief, that would be 4 sergeants, it would be a corporal, That corporal would function as a supervisor or a line personnel dependent upon absenteeism. It would require 4 police officers. So essentially what you're looking at is 10 sworn staff of those particular ranks. Rich already mentioned, as well as Tony, that you need improved training to be a best-in-class agency. Our recommendation is 40 hours per year per sworn staff. We would suggest that you adopt an enhanced approach to equipping officers. That would include body-worn cameras for every officer. You'd also improve your administrative support, and you'd have a full-time civilian administrative assistant or technician supporting the police department. We have recommended, and it's detailed in our report, an increased salaries to be more competitive in the marketplace. You do offer outstanding benefits, but we still recommend increased salaries because, frankly, the younger generations are interested in the money on the table. So the cost for an in-house, best-in-class police department, as we devised and detailed in the report, is about $720,000 more per year than your existing police department. Now, what's important to recognize here is that $720,000 is malleable. You can change a couple of figures very easily, and it can go down. By example, if the community and board didn't want to provide the raises that we recommended, that number would be reduced by $367,000 just by eliminating raises. So more than half of that figure would go away if you eliminated the raise component to our recommendation. So decision number 2, the full contract service delivery component. So what does that look like? Well, we built a model that basically looks as follows. That would be a sworn manager who would act as your chief of police, be located in the facility as we suggested, and that would probably be a lieutenant or captain in an adjoining agency that would act as your chief of police. It would probably require 1.5 field sergeants providing beat supervision on a 24/7 basis. You may ask, well, why only 1.5 over 24 hours? Well, the bottom line is that's what you'd probably be charged for, because those sergeants would not only be supervising the Kensington officer, they'd be supervising other officers in other beats in their community. It would take about 5 officers assigned to cover the Kensington beats 24/7, 365. And we also built in a half-time detective dedicated to you to do investigative services, as well as a civilian police assistant. So what does that look like? It looks like basically contract staff with total 9 positions, 8 sworn and 1 civilian position, compared to your best-in-class in-house enhanced alternative of 11 positions, which is 10 sworn and 1 civilian position. This cost would approximate $858,000 more per year compared to your existing police department. And once again, let me remind you that that $858,000 can be dramatically different depending upon what the contractor proposes. By example, most contractors provide an overhead charge to manage the contracts. The city manager gets loaded into it. The HR director gets loaded to it. Their chief of police gets loaded into it, et cetera, et cetera. And that ranges anywhere from 8 to 15% of a contract typically. But there are some agencies out there that don't charge an overhead rate because they want the business, because they want to add to their sworn personnel. And if, by example, that overhead rate went away, that $858,000 figure would be reduced by $387,000. So that's why these numbers, these pro forma budgets, are very dynamic, dependent upon the decisions that are made by either a contractor or the community for an in-house police department. So what does decision number 3 look like? That's the hybrid. And again, this is more detailed than it was in the original draft report because we got a lot more feedback. So what are some of the hybrid possibilities? And we're going to talk about 2 of them that would probably have the most dramatic impact. Remember, there are literally dozens of hybrids that could be developed. So example one would be Kensington provides a day shift patrol, and a contractor provides a one-officer night shift patrol and response. What that means is a contractor would actually field at nighttime one officer in a Kensington beat. All right? If they needed assistance, they'd call for backup from their community. If they needed supervisor, they'd call for a sergeant from their community. But you'd essentially be paying for one full-time officer that would patrol your community. Another example is Kensington provides a day shift patrol, and there is no night shift patrol. Sidewalks get rolled up, and basically you pay for each call for service that comes out. Nothing else, not patrol services. So Officer Matthews, on the one call during the night on average that you get, would come out and respond to that call for service, and once I was done managing that call for service, I'd go away. So that's another potential hybrid model that you could implement. There are other potential hybrid contract services that include having contracted investigations, records services, personnel services such as recruitment services, property and evidence management, focused traffic enforcement. You may want a motor officer, contract for a motor officer for dedicated traffic enforcement. Again, a variety of hybrid opportunities. And those hybrid model costs can vary significantly compared to both your existing operation as well as an enhanced operation, dependent upon what you might select as a hybrid option. Because of all of these variables involved, accurately costing out a hybrid model is very difficult, and you would have to solicit your potential partners to get that kind of information. So the next slide, major cost impacts compared to current in-house services. So both an in-house model and a full service contract model are obviously more expensive than current police operations. We already showed you figures of $700,000 to $850,000 more per year in our illustrative examples. And an in-house police approach cost impacts include these kinds of things: additional staff resources and higher job classifications. We'd be adding sergeant job classifications. We recommended higher salaries. There are operational increases that we detailed in the report to include additional training, additional costs for such things as cameras, etc. There are also potential full service contract cost implications. You would have fewer staff in our model in a full service contract, but their overall compensation at those organizations is higher than yours. You would have shared management in a full service contract. You would continue to pay Kensington's retirees other post-employment benefits. Those are the medical, vision, and dental benefits that you give your retirees. And you continue payment of the higher unfunded accrued liability for CalPERS because you would go on an inactive status at CalPERS if you went for a full service contract as opposed to an active status. We already talked about those administrative overhead charges that would likely be incurred, but not certainly. And those administrative overhead charges could range from 8 to 15% of that full services contract. Next page. So what are some other major cost impacts compared to current in-house services? As we mentioned, some hybrid models could potentially cost the community more, such as if you had an in-house police department fully, but you wanted to contract for a detective, you could do that. That's a hybrid model. It'd cost you more, but you could do it. Alternatively, some hybrid models could potentially be more cost-effective compared to existing and recommended service approaches. We gave you one example. One example was we'll have a day shift patrol with our in-house police department, and we'll only have a partner respond to calls for service at night. That could be significantly less expensive. Examples of the possible cost-saving opportunities for full-service in-house police patrol response during the day shift, but reduced services at night, as I just suggested. And what you would find in that example is that I just gave is the officer would not be here from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. They'd only respond per call that they come to. In our model in the report, we suggested they'd get about $125 per call to handle the call. But you only have approximately 385 calls a year in that period from 9 p.m. to 9 a.m. By example, remember Rich mentioned proactive time. Proactive time is that time that is available after responding to calls for service. So the quote-unquote free time that a police officer has to do other things. From 10 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock in the morning here in Kensington, where proactive time is 93%. That means they're responding to calls during that period of time 7% of their entire time. So what are some of the key strategies, and that we'll wrap it up, that Rich will do, and then we'll be happy to take some questions from you.
Hello again. So the key strategies are really about the choices that you have. Hopefully we can all agree to a greater or lesser extent that based on your own experience as well as our analysis, that there are some significant law enforcement issues in this community that get down to basically a lot of it is lack of investment in staffing, lack of investment in management and management systems and supervision, training, policy development, oversight, and equipment. So you've got a number of choices, and Greg has summarized those, and they're really up to you. But you need to address those issues. They're not going to go away. You can hope to achieve those changes by enhancing the services in your own district's police services. You could look at a wide variety of opportunities to contract out either the entire operation or selected professional or support services. But you can't escape the conclusion that there needs to be some change, and that change needs to be require more investment. So as Greg has mentioned, our analysis has hundreds of variables in it. You change any of them and it changes the bottom line cost figure, but you're still going to be paying more in almost any scenario. So this is where this has been a long road for this community getting to this step, but you've got more to go. We think the next step should be to test the waters and to get RFPs for either full service or hybrid, your decision to see, because our analysis again is based on these hundreds of variables. For one reason or another, a neighbor may decide that they want to have a partner in a neighboring community because it gives them, because they're smaller departments except for Berkeley, but the two immediate on this side have real advantages of expanding their force through a contract. It provides more resources for them, more ability to do things in a multi-agency or a multi-beat environment that they can't really do right now. So you might find that it's attractive to them, but you won't know until you test the waters. And it doesn't cost you much to do that, but it gives you more information that you need to make that decision. Otherwise, it's our analysis, as good as that hopefully is, you really don't know until you test that waters. Or you could decide that control is more important to you and you want your own police force, but you're still left with these issues. And you're still left with the risks that we've identified and the management issues which periodically recur in the community. So, well, I'm done. So we'll take your questions now.
So I was going to get a little help here from Peter to pass the mic, but we have a quick hand here right up front.
I'm Jerry Michaels from Highland. And my question is, if the board decides in the long run to go outside with the whole police department, I notice a lot of the neighbors around here have signs, please don't do away with our police department. I would like to see if there would be a vote for Kensington, all the Kensington people to vote on what the board decides. That's a question for the board.
Yes. I think that was more of a comment.
Yeah, I had some questions and a comment. As you know, we're only about 50 yards from the Hayward Fault, and sometimes it can rip up to 20 feet. I would feel better if there were emergency services that were on hand to handle that, and it could happen, of course, any time of the day or night, and any day. Second thing is, this area has a historic record of wildfires coming over the ridge. And again, with only one policeman on duty or something like that at 2 o'clock in the morning, if it happens, I see that as kind of a disaster. Yes, you'll have help from the other neighboring police departments, but I'm not sure that they'd get here in time. Then I have a question for you. What is the rule or the law that officers have to be, that is badged officers have to be paid according to, or the retirement has to go through CalPERS? Is that a law? Why are we doing it?
A small agency would have a difficult time having its own retirement system that would be attractive to
About 401ks.
The CalPERS or the various public retirement funds are much more generous than 401ks.
Yeah, but then you could raise the salaries. Isn't that part of the problem?
Absolutely. Yeah, sure, you could.
Okay, that might help.
Yeah, absolutely. So on your first two questions, when the earthquake happens, when the fire happens, everybody in the region is going to be impacted by that. And I think that's one of the reasons why one of the important assumptions that we use in this analysis is that you have to have somebody on duty here around the clock, and this isn't an extension of a beat down the hill that the officers would be on the wrong side of the fault line.
And the last comment is, and I know you've heard this before, but I really would feel a lot better if the police department badged officers were local, that they lived here, or at least very close to here. I don't know where the officers come from now, but I suspect it could be as far as from Antigua or Livermore. For God's sakes, they couldn't get here in half a day of the right, under the wrong circumstance.
That is a problem throughout the Bay Area.
Yeah, so with your option 3 or decision 3, possibly you could incorporate some retired people here and train them so that maybe or maybe not they're badged officers, but at least they're trained well enough so that they could handle some of the emergencies. And maybe some of the staff work, who knows? But this is a retirement community to some extent. There's a lot of us around.
You know, that's an interesting point, and I think that some of the things that we're talking about in terms of ability to recruit and retain staff, the cost of law enforcement personnel are such that volunteerism or a different kind of reserves is gaining favor throughout the state, both in the Bay Area and Southern California, certainly for administrative support, but even for things like, crime prevention types of activities and emergency response. And so training people in the community to help out in emergencies is something that many communities do, but you don't have the staff to help train the people to do it. So it gets to be this circular problem again.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Andrew Reed. I live in Coventry. Given what the general manager, Tony, said in his introduction about the facts on the ground that we have little interest in the adjacent departments. Perhaps El Cerrito may have an interest, plus the cost figures that you folks have given for Decision 1 or Decision 2. As a practical matter, in your report, I looked at it briefly. I see aggregate numbers. You give the bottom line for the two broad directions, and we know that the hybrid model is going to have to test out depending on what we want. Do you folks provide breakout numbers, like a menu of costs for example, if the community wants to retain the force, but it makes certain investments? Because given our financial situation, I'm guessing here, but I don't know that we're going to come up with 700 or 900 in the first year. So can you please speak to where do you see the spectrum of investment? Are you providing a prioritization of those investments? Because if we can't afford everything, what would you start, and what would your rough estimate be on the dollars for the top, let's say, 3 investments if we retain the police? Thank you.
So Greg may want to add to this, but let me just say in general that the report, when you look at it in more detail, will show that there are line item build-up analyses of all of the costs that are there, which allows you to do some a la carte. We have not really prioritized them, but the first and foremost recommendation we have is the most costly one, because your ability to train, your ability to have an effectively supervised and managed force gets back to the number of people you have. And if you've got 6 or 7 people, it's hard to have a fully functioning police department. So adding the people is first and foremost what you need, but that's the bigger ticket item.
Sorry, what I really wanted to hear from you is, we've been going along at a certain level for a while, and I guess we're authorized for 10 officers, including the chief, right? So forget what's actually happening now. Compare the budget authority we have now with your recommendation. It might be best practice to have a supervisor and an officer on each shift, but the contradicting information is we're a safe community. I've heard Mr. Watt get up constantly and talk about how safe we are. Maybe we could get along with 7 officers. So what's between where we are now and your best practice? Are you saying that we legally have to do the best practice? Is it a would-like? If we can't have the would-like, how can we accomplish something in between for maybe $400,000?
It's a risk management question, but it's not an abstract one. I mean, being in the newspaper because of internal affairs kinds of issues are significant issues that happen pretty regularly in this 10-person police department that often happens fewer. It has to do with management oversight and control and effective first-line supervision. That's what it gets down to. So that it isn't abstract. You're right, there's no mandate for it. But just like, am I going to insure my house for one level rather than the other? It's how you want to manage risk in your life.
Sorry, I promise this is my last comment. I'll shut up after this. What the elephant in the room here is really, all of this goes to leadership. And in my consultancy work, usually you start with leadership first, and you work things down. So your investment, you've made comments about the chief of police. So back to the top 3. If tomorrow you woke up and you were in charge of this, and you didn't have $750,000, and you only had one maybe bidder, which is really not a competitive situation, where would you put the first 400? Would it be to put the extra salary in the chief and let things slow down from there? How would you structure the approach?
First line supervision. It's the most important position in any police department. I'd make sure we had a well-trained, qualified, experienced sergeant on duty.
Hi, I'm Meryl Rafferty, and I have to say I owned and ran a consulting firm in change management for 27 years. And I looked at the results of our Phase 1 strengths, and I have never seen such positive numbers in any report in my career as we have for our Kensington Police. 98% of our community feels safe. 85% of the questionnaire respondents rated their contact with Kensington Police as positive, and response times are reasonable. So given the results of your first phase, and given the fact that the community overwhelmingly has stated it wants to keep a police force, why did you bother going to the idea of contracting? Why did you not focus on how do we improve our existing police force?
I think the simple answer is we were asked to. We were contracted to look at in-house improvements as well as contract feasibility. Yeah, that was what our contract was.
Thank you for the comments are all very illuminating. I have a question about if you have a hybrid model for moving outside the district. You've talked about Berkeley. I think that the UC Police Department did not even return calls. You have Albany and you have El Cerrito. But no one has talked too much about the county. And you guys are well aware, probably more than other people in this room, that there are so many districts in California that are unincorporated and they have to rely entirely on county aid. Why has not the county been a larger factor in trying to figure out a hybrid model that could be covering what is needed on nights, weekends, and so on? Thank you.
I think that the hybrids options opens the floor a little bit. Less so on patrol coverage, because you're still subject to these issues about adjacency and immediacy for emergencies. However, for something like records management, property and evidence, training, investigations, contiguity isn't that important. So you could open up functional alternatives to anybody in the county.
I agree with you, but I got a house in Glen Ellen. I got a house in Glen Ellen, which is miles from Santa Rosa, okay? And that is serviced entirely by county cops, and no one has ever had a problem. They can be there if you want them because they patrol if they know they're supposed to be in the area on certain. So I think it's more than just the services you talk about are fine, but patrolling is also very much in the picture. All you have to do is have someone that you know has to be there and you're willing to front them.
I would agree with that, except that we use the community input to help develop assumptions. And on the Saturday meeting that I remember almost a year ago, that very strong opinions were stated about presence here, not responding from somewhere else.
Hi. Isn't it a fact that we are staffed for the number of people that you are recommending essentially as police officers right now? We are authorized for that, but we don't have those positions filled. And that current practice is there is supervision by reference to an individual supervisor by telephone, which is essentially the hybrid that you're postulating that we could get from another institution, another entity, which doesn't seem to want us anyway. And what we really need to do is to staff up.
So with regard to your comment about you have authorized 10 staff, and we recommended an authorized 10 staff, that is absolutely correct. We just reformulated what those authorized 10 staff look like. We had 4 sergeants in there where you do not have presently 4 sergeants in your operation. With regard to your comment, and it's very well taken, is you need to have your fully authorized staff contingent. And that is some of the reasons we made some of the recommendations we did to attract and retain qualified professional police officers if you choose to have an enhanced in-house police department. Now, with regard to your comment regarding supervision, in a hybrid model, a sergeant is not going to be on the phone. A sergeant in a hybrid model would come from an adjoining agency. And in a hybrid model, if you had patrol services, by example, at night, you'd contract potentially for one officer, but if that officer needed 1, 2, or 3 additional officers, they'd come from their own agency. Hold on. They'd come from their additional agency, as well as a sergeant. So part of your hybrid contract would include how are we going to get backup, how are we going to get supervision. It wouldn't be by telephone.
And you already have mutual aid compacts with adjoining communities, correct? I mean, and what I'm saying is, what we need to do is we need to staff up to what we have as far as positions, perhaps with some refinement that you've suggested, perhaps starting at the top with leadership, has been suggested in this room from various people who are professionals and yourselves. And we need to get off this train of perpetually talking about what we ought to do, which is what we already have and have to perform on. I'm sorry, I'm feeling like a soapbox here, but it just seems like we're going on a train that we can't stop because somebody set us on this railroad and we never pull into the station.
I hate to have to follow Linda. So I have a couple of questions. A question was asked previously at one of the other meetings, which is why now? Why now when we know we only have one contiguous community that's even maybe interested, and that community, as we know, is in dire financial straits, and of course they would want to contract with us because we can help them out. So that's my first question, why now? Secondly, if we were to go to an RFP, would we be putting it out to just the communities that you've mentioned, the contiguous communities you mentioned, Albany, El Cerrito, Berkeley? That would be it? That's a yes?
Again, we use the community meetings to help develop the assumptions in the analysis. So that was a key assumption. However, you could open it up and let these other communities be creative about how they're going to bridge that important assumption gap that led us down the road to El Cerrito, Albany, and Berkeley.
Okay. My next question is, do you know that these other potential contiguous communities, El Cerrito, Albany, Berkeley for now, have best practices? You're telling us we should have best practices. Do they have all these best practices? Have you examined that? Have you looked at their training, their equipment, their salaries, et cetera? And are you confident that if we were to align ourselves with them, that we would be getting best practices?
We did do that. We didn't study them as part of the study, but we conducted interviews, collected information that showed us that they meet more best practices than you do. One of the communities, Berkeley, is a former client, so we know them quite well.
Okay.
Let me answer that. I know you're not done, but let me augment that answer. When you potentially contract with someone, part of your contract terms and conditions has performance elements. You build in those performance elements in your contract to ensure they're consistent with best practices, whether it's a response time to priority 1, whether it's 2 officers will always respond to a certain type of call. That is built into your contract so you can monitor and ensure that what they're doing is consistent with the best practices you expect.
Appreciate that. We do know that once you enter into a contract, the next time the contract comes up for renewal, everything's up for grabs again, just a note. Finally, how much does it cost to do an RFP for outsourcing, contracting out, whatever you want to call it, alternative services, I think what you call it, and could we do, instead, have you tell us how we answer the questions that have been asked in the back part of the room about how we could better spend the money that we have to bring our department up to maybe not your definition of best practices, but rather a definition of best practices for our community. Would that cost as much as going out to an RFP? So I'd like to know exactly what the cost would be of doing an RFP for outsourcing, what it would be for doing it just for hybrid, what the combination cost would be, and if you could just instead tell us how we could prioritize.
So you know that if you choose to go the RFP route, part of our contract is to help facilitate that, to develop it, help guide you through that process. That contract, that part of the contract is $12,000 if you choose to do it. You could choose to go the RFP route and not use us and use people within the community who have experience doing that to do something like that. So that's clear, that's what the costs are. So in terms of,
The question was, what would be the cost if we only did a hybrid? For an RFP hybrid.
we didn't even know hybrids existed at the time as an option. Probably because it's the same amount of work. You're developing a legal document. You're getting it, in that case, to more communities than your 3 immediate neighbors and helping you evaluate very different things. So probably something of that order of magnitude. So,
What's the cost if we just, as the experts, to tell us how we can prioritize?
okay. Well, we believe that except for the priorities, that's really clear in the Phase 1 report. So we could help. What? Yeah, well, we could certainly do that as part of this contract.
Okay. We've got plenty of questions. Here you go.
At the first town hall meeting, a resident commented that according to the US DOJ, almost half of the nation's police departments have 10 or fewer officers. You said that in one of your reports that in California it's 1 out of 30, which makes that about 3%. That resident also asked about Matrix's experience in advising such small agencies. Will you provide the names of 3 agencies, cities, towns, whatever, that you have advised that have a small police department? In particular, were they advised that they have to bring their departments up to best practices with 10 sworn officers? And a question that has been raised by a number of people is the cost of that. And I did a quick analysis for the average property in Kensington, which is assessed at about $500,000. That's going to be a tax increase to Kensington residents of 25 to 30%. And about over half of the properties in Kensington actually have had people living in them for over 20 years. And the assessed value of those properties is probably closer to $250,000. So they're going to be looking at a property tax increase, taxes plus assessments of 35 to 50%. So is this what other small towns had to do to bring their police up to code?
I could get you a more complete list, but just in the past couple of years, some of the communities we've worked with that have around 10 or even fewer are all out of this state. We've worked in several long time ago in the Central Valley, like Parlier, which is in Fresno County, and some others. But recently, most of the very small communities we work with have been out of state because there's too many big cities in California. So Mendham, New Jersey, Narberth, Pennsylvania, places like that, where that has been the focus of our study, is both bringing them up to effective staffing, especially oversight at a supervisory or management level, and the ability to get forces effectively trained. In the 2 states I just mentioned, property taxes are much higher than they are in California in aggregate, even though the properties aren't assessed as highly. But they've all had to go back for either raising the property tax level or some kind of special assessment.
all of you raising your hand, we will get to you. Rich and I are committed to be here till 10 o'clock, so.
We are?
Just, well, okay, I'll stay here. Who's raising their hand? All right. Go ahead.
I had a question. You said that it was $700,000+ to bring us up to to a 10-person department with 4 sergeants and a corporal and detective and pay. We already are staffed for 10, is what the budget's for, is 10 people, 3 sergeants, a corporal, and a detective. So I don't see where the 700,000+ is going to come from. We're not looking to get a 25% raise. I don't know where these numbers are coming from because it's awful high for something we already have.
Okay, so for those of you that have the report, probably you don't. On page 5 of the executive summary that you can reference, you'll see where this $720,000 comes from. The gentleman just suggested that we're not asking for a 25% raise, but we did build in a 25% raise to be competitive with your regional neighbors despite the exceptional benefits that you offer. Of the $720,000, $367,000 of that was that 25% raise. Reformulating the 10 people that you have in the way we described was $130,000 in new salary positions. Then there's benefit increases, retirement, Social Security, et cetera.
We already have those.
Differential pay between police officers and sergeants.
Yes.
No, well, we have a master sergeant, which actually gets 12% more. We have 2 sergeants that are 14% more. Or the 6% is on top of the 14%. And then we have a corporal that gets, I believe, 4%. So if you take away the master sergeant, you make him a sergeant, a regular sergeant, and then you bring the corporal up, you're basically talking about the same money. So I don't know where that extra money's coming from.
Well, it's detailed in the
percentages.
It's detailed in the report. But so just give you one other number. Your training a couple of years ago was about $4,000.
We actually do a lot of training.
Well, I'm telling
I know
you,
guys are beating us up on that. We're actually post-compliant. We do have our training. The only training we're not going to is stuff we're asking to go to that we're being denied because they're not wanting to spend the money on it.
So
We have time to do it, but they're not allowing us to.
So with respect to your question, what you had as a $4,000 line item, we raised to a $78,000 line item to provide you with 40 hours of training per sworn staff, to provide leadership training to your chief, and those types of things. So the details are located in the report relative to where these individual line items came. But let me remind you of what we said in our presentation. That number can change significantly depending upon decisions on how your community implements our recommended best practices. If you only get a 15% raise, that $708,000 number is going to go down somewhat dramatically. So again, that is one of the pro forma budget numbers that can shift dependent upon the decisions that you make as a board and as a community.
This fellow here next, and people over.
Have you been waiting?
I think there's kind of an elephant in the room in the report. We've had a number of the police officers who've been, I'll just politely saying, have behaved badly. And frankly, I don't think they should be on our police force. And the question is there any way to, we'll say, get rid of these people without contracting? Well, that's a reason to contract, because we have badly behaving police department.
Well, sure, it gets down to the basic characteristics of a police department of having sound policies and procedures, effective first-line supervision, progressive discipline, and with ultimate sanctions for repetitive poor behavior. That's basic in a police department.
Right here. And then
What about, you took the microphone away from him, he never came back.
again, we're all here.
So-
I'll get you.
Yeah. Johanna Furman, I welcome your comments on performance standards and really making sure that we are holding people accountable. But this really is whether we contract or not. And so I wonder if you would address that in terms of the need for standards and training of both the folks in the police department and on the board.
You're absolutely right, and we've said that extensively in the report, that we worked with the community in these meetings, and based on our experience, developed some performance standards in every area of law enforcement. Their direct service, support services, training, and things like that. Those standards are true for you, and they're true for any potential contracting partner. So there are standards that you would hold them to. The issue is that other communities may already have all or most of that in place. And that's something for you to determine in the RFP development and review process.
Okay. Please.
Okay. There are two things that I'm sure everybody will agree with me. Two things have to happen when you call the police. One, somebody has to answer the phone. Number two, you want a cop to show up real fast. I've lived here for 35 years. I've had occasion to use the police, to need the police. Every single time they've showed up really pronto with a well-trained, smart, dedicated, interested policeman. And so how do you improve on that? And I'm sure it's the lack of training and policy development and best management practices and others. That's great. I want a cop to show up who cares about his citizens, and that is the way it is. Put a question mark on the end of that.
Thank you very much for pointing out that top leadership is really important. For the last 20 years, we've had leadership that has basically been driving the train downhill, to use this metaphor. And without that, we may continue to do that. 20 years ago, we were saying that there was a conflict of interest between having the same person be the general manager and also to be the police chief. And it took all that time to finally get somebody who's independent and can give independent advice. The question I'm asking is, how can we assure that we get top-notch police leadership? Thank you.
I can answer the question. That is going to, just like it is for police officers, it's effective recruiting and backgrounding the police officers or chief, and interviews with the board, the general manager, and the community to make sure there's an appropriate fit. But the backgrounding is obviously very important. And you would want a chief who has experience working in and managing a small law enforcement agency.
Sorry about that. A question based on your experience is what happens, this is in the context of a full service contract, what happens if the performance isn't there? What happens if your contractor encounters financial difficulties, management difficulties? What if your service provider basically goes belly up? What are your remedies? How easy is it to remedy your situation, to replace your police department? And since you've been in this situation several hundred times, perhaps you've seen situations like that, and it would be illuminating if you could share some of your experiences.
That's a really good question. And contract agencies, that is to say, cities mostly, that are contracting for law enforcement services, mostly with county sheriffs, are asking this question all over California, where, especially in counties where contracts are very common, Orange County particularly, San Bernardino, Riverside County certainly, LA County and others, because they often don't feel like they're getting the service that they want and they desire and that they're contracting for. So what has been happening around the state is agencies have threatened to withdraw, realizing that the startup costs for a police department are rather daunting in terms of facilities, so don't get rid of your facility, cars and things like that, and the startup cost of having a contracting entity for a year while you're trying to rebuild your police department for a year. Those are substantial. However, this isn't all one-sided. The agency that's providing services has benefits too. And in each of these situations I've referred to, and in many of those we have been working with the agencies that have had an interest in withdrawing. 9 agencies in Riverside County, all 13 contract cities in Orange County, separately with Laguna Hills, San Clemente, and a couple of others, have been able to renegotiate the contract to guarantee what they've got, and often with a reduction in costs. We worked with La Quinta. It's one of the most affluent countries in the world, cities in the world. They could afford to have a police officer in every corner, but they were wasting their money on effective law enforcement, and they reduced their contract. They bill on a service hours per week with the county, and they reduced the number of hours per week by 28, which was a lot of money. And we've been working with them every year to monitor that. So it's a really good question, and it gets back to contract management. I mean, who's going to do that in this environment here if you contract it? You know, it's difficult. You got a part-time general manager, and nobody. You don't expect a board member to do that. That's a hard thing to get a handle on, but it's the most important part of contract management.
Good evening. As some of you know, I'm on the Finance Committee, and I'm also Scottish, and I get very concerned about substantial increases in costs. And I'd like to just focus on the 2 proposals, one being to enhance the department here versus possibly contracting out, presumably to El Cerrito. Regarding contracting here, included in those costs, as has been mentioned here this evening, is some $360,000, I believe it was, of a 25% increase in salary costs. And my question for you on that one is, why would we give, and I even heard from the sergeant here, that didn't seem to be that important to him, and I agree, for this reason. We have one of the best benefit programs for our officers here in the area. We are currently setting aside for this year $400,000 to handle our OPEB costs, and we also only ask our officers to contribute 4% for their PERS contributions versus the 12% that El Cerrito does. So my question is, why would we go up to 25%? That's question number 1, okay? And that, as you know, adds about $360,000 to the project. Apparently you want to answer that one.
So with respect to our recommendation of 25% salary raise makes you competitive in a salary component with your regional partners. Let's address, though, your important observation regarding your benefits. You're absolutely correct that you offer outstanding benefits here at Kensington related to retiree health benefits, related to the proportion of CalPERS you pay, etc. Unfortunately, our experience now in 21st century policing is people in their early 20s, middle 20s, late 20s, the officers that you want to attract and retain, they don't really care about these benefits. They care about base salary. So why would I want to come to work for Kensington at $70,000 a year salary when I can go to work for El Cerrito for $90,000 a year? So that is one of the reasons that we suggested that you augment your salary. There was a recent study done by Pew that ranked what officers believed were important things to do as a police officer. What were the important components? Out of 9 categories, interestingly, salary was 6th. Salary was 6th out of 9. So that's really interesting. One of the other interesting components on that survey was, what was number 2? Crime fighting. Well, there's no crime fighting going on in Kensington. So the ability to attract police officers is not going to rely on rank number 2 out of 9, crime fighting. You're going to have to find other ways to attract officers, and one of them would be potentially salary. So again, our model, as we suggested, built in 25%. The sergeants suggest you don't need 25%. Well, that's 708,000, then we'll come down. So you had a second question.
the Gray Panthers.
So the other question that I had to do with if we were to go with, let's say, El Cerrito, included in your costs for the if we were at El Cerrito, we were going to have 9 officers. And the salaries that you showed there totaled out on average at $155,000. That's without benefits. With the benefits, those costs went up to $233,000 per officer. That is not right at all. I was just down at El Cerrito. The actual costs for an El Cerrito officer, salary and benefits, are $190,000. So you have overstated the amount of money that it would have cost had we gone down to El Cerrito and used them as our contracting agency. I just want to point out that I think that these costs of $720,000 and $850,000 to go either in-house or out of house are excessive. Thank you.
Okay, who is next?
I'm next. My name's Kay. I live on Cup.
Have you gone?
What?
Have you gone? Did you already ask a question?
Yeah, I did
Okay,
ask
let me-
a
okay.
question. I really wanted to answer the
Okay.
second question.
A question for you folks. In the recommendations are some recommendations about strategic planning. And I'm with Linda that we want to get on the train eventually and move down the track. But I'm just curious, it would seem like some of these questions about keep, go, do half and half could actually be resolved in part of the strategic planning process. And so are you suggesting that along with this stay-go, there is some kind of way that people think about how to do, is that part of the process?
Absolutely.
And who is going to help the board do that and facilitate a community process?
There are a number of even free resources in a community like this. People who have experience doing that. They're not very costly to do that. But, I think regardless, this issue has in some ways fractured this community in terms of what you think the solution is. I think that'd be fair to say. But I think you all agree you want a good police force. And I think you just need to get on the same page about what some of those solutions are, and that is a good process. Who's next? All right. I got. You want to use this?
I find myself being a little bit mystified, and I'm wondering if you're considering Kensington's topography. You talk about how our safety is at risk with our current department, but I find it really hard to believe that a contractor could come in who's on duty at nighttime, could come in and know our streets, know who the residents are, and that somehow we would be safer because someone was on the phone with that person, rather than what we have now?
I think that's a really good question. And again, I draw on our actual experience working with contract communities in comparable communities in terms of economics and expectations. And by having the ability in a contract to have some stability in who is assigned to Kensington, they're professionals. They want to do a good job. They want to be engaged with the community. And they do that, whether they're contractor or the police, your own police department. Well, no, but whether you are requesting a service in a call or whether you're engaged with an officer on the street is the same officer and potentially the same person. They are going to get to know people. Your police officers don't know everybody in the community, but with stability and training, they'll know the streets, and over time, they will know the community.
Hi.
It isn't an occupying army. They have an interest in being professional and to provide effective service, and that's what all of their training and experience leads them to.
Hi, I just have one question about one of your data points, and it's about the nighttime as well. So you mentioned the figures for the amount of time that officers spend answering calls in the nighttime versus proactive. And I just wondered if they're doing stuff that arose organically from circumstances, like stuff that I've witnessed out my window in the middle of the night, police work, law enforcement. Were you counting that under the 3% of the time that they were answering calls, or 97% of the time that they're proactive?
That's a good question. It depends on the circumstance, but usually that's a self-initiated activity. It's out of the proactive time.
Is it counted by you as a call, or
Unless somebody calls 911 or calls the police service on a 7-digit number, or there's an alarm or a flag down or something like that, it's officer-initiated activity. It's not a request for service or a call.
Hi. So, quick question. I was wondering, what was rank 1? I mean, that list you said rank 2 was crime fighting. What was the top at rank 1?
I don't know.
I also had a technical question about contracts. So, in a contract, hybrid or full, is there any way legally that you can have the contract lock an officer into a beat, even if the contracting agency sees that there's a higher priority in another beat for that officer? Essentially going to this idea of 24/7 police presence. And I'm just kind of balancing that with the fact that someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but mutual aid and priority beats are triggered at different levels of severity.
Usually in the contracts, there are extenuating circumstance kinds of clauses that, depending on serious calls, they can leave the area. But unless something like that happens, they're in your beat. Clearly, you'd be having to work really hard with a potential contracting entity to get something like this, because it's not in their interest to have somebody not available for their community and just for contracting. But they do it, and often that's clearly written in the contract. In fact, in many communities, in Orange County, just to come up with one example, the community or the city manager or the council are actually making the decisions about which lieutenants and which sergeants and sometimes deputies are assigned to their community, and they'll interview them.
Hi, I just wanted to mention two things that aren't in the report. For our nighttime, and actually for all our police force, we have a priority for medical emergencies. That means if an officer in our police force is called for a medical emergency, that takes priority over every kind of backup. In addition, if we contracted out, that would go away. And our beat officer would be called out anytime an officer in another district needed backup. That's not the case with our current information. And I don't think that was mentioned in the report. And then my question for you, given the fact that we just settled a $90,000 suit against our interim chief and there are other suits pending, would you think that getting a permanent chief who was trained and had our best interests at heart would be our top priority as a community? That was a question. No, I'm asking you, if you were asked to pick a top priority for our community, wouldn't that be it?
It's a high priority. I agree with you.
Thank you.
I have a question on the 12-hour shifts. If I remember your recommendation right, you recommended 12-hour shifts. Now, how often do you find 12-hour shifts in police departments in general? And number two, did you do the 12-hour shifts because this is basically what our officers like to work, because they then get 4.5 days off? Now, my big concern, as it always is, you work an officer for 12 hours, and then you have something happening, and that officer works another hour or two overtime. And I really object to us giving an automobile and a gun to a person who then works 14 consecutive hours, because I think we're irresponsible when we do this. So my question to you is, are 12-hour shifts normal within the industry, and why did you recommend the 12 hours?
Let me take a first shot at that, so to speak. They're very common, especially in Sunbelt states, and especially in smaller communities, even in California. And one of the reasons for it is it's a quality of life thing, as you identified. And in your situation, when you're trying to attract and retain people, an attractive work schedule where they get more time with their families or to do what they want to do is viewed to be very important. We do not recommend 12-hour shifts in larger cities where they're going from call to call to call, and where degradation of mental alertness and fitness, especially after hour 8 or 9 or 10, is going to be an issue. And you respond to a call in hour 11, and you're working for another 3 hours writing a report and processing an arrestee. This is not that kind of community. So I think for the staff recruitment, retention issues alone, it's an important consideration. And again, you wouldn't be alone. Lots of communities do it. Greg?
I don't have anything to add to that.
The model,
Right.
the model that you have put forth recommends a substantial increase in salary. And if that is to be competitive with the other regional districts, if the salaries are so low, I would expect there to be a large movement of the officers who are here to other higher paying jurisdictions. I'm not seeing that. And I wish perhaps you could explain why that is not happening.
It has been happening.
I am not aware of that happening, and if you are, please do tell me.
You've had vacant positions for people leaving for a wide variety of reasons, but including higher pay to other law enforcement agencies for several years. You haven't been up to 10 staff. I mean, we didn't do exit interviews, so we don't know why everybody left, but to the extent that anybody left to go to another law enforcement agency, that is likely to be a factor. That's a best practice. Putting you on the spot. Why do people leave or not come here?
Chris Turner, Chris Armanino. We have a couple other ones that are probably going to leave. We've had other people, they've gone to other jobs, and I know one guy who's made over $200,000 this year, so because of overtime, and he's working at a SO. People are leaving. So some of them are staying because they care about the people they work with right now. Otherwise, they would leave because they would make more money somewhere else. Or financially, they're okay because of a family member that's working or something.
Is it money or the environment that we're experiencing?
it's tough for some of these guys because of some of the negativity and all that. But the people that work here do generally like the people here. They care about the people, you know. They're invested, and the money is not that great. They do want raises, but they're not asking for 20% raises. Every year we're trying to get, 3 or 4, and the last few years we've been getting 3s and giving back 1%, or we're starting to pay into our medical, but everybody says we have great everything. Guys are getting beat up, so we are losing people because of that. So.
Thank you. I have a quick question about the supervision issue. When our officers are by themselves in the evening, of course, they can call for backup from our neighboring jurisdictions. But am I correct that when a neighboring backup comes, even if it is a sergeant or a higher position, they have no authority over our officer? Our officer's line of command continues to be within Kensington, so even when they have backup, the supervision still has to come from within the department. They have to call the chief or call a supervisor. Is that correct?
Well, operationally, you're still going to have a police officer go look for help from the experienced officer, even if it's from another jurisdiction. And that's what's going to happen in a mutual aid situation.
Thank you for coming and responding to all the questions. So my question is a little bit different. I'm going to give you $800,000. You can choose to spend it on each of your 3 models. I'd like you to give us as succinct explanation as to why one model would be better than another model for the service to the residents of the town.
Rich said he's going to let me take that. Great. So if you had given me $800,000 and you said I could do anything that I would want with it, I would not do a full service contract. I would not do a full in-house police department. I'd do a hybrid model. I'd have your in-house police department provide services during the day shift. I would contract out for professional detectives somewhere else because, frankly, in other agencies that have more crime to investigate, you gain skills by investigating crime. So I would use outside detectives and pay for that. You want dedicated traffic enforcement based on information that we received during the town hall meetings. I'd hire a couple of contract motor officers to do dedicated traffic enforcement. I would do, in a hybrid model, I would contract out night shift patrol. So you're asking me what I would do with $800,000. Rich's answer might be different for $800,000. Clearly, all of your answers are going to be different than $800,000. That's why we've given you these various options for a full-service in-house police department, a full-service contract, and a variety of hybrids. You have a follow-up.
No, I appreciate that answer, but it wasn't really quite my question. My question was why one model would prove to provide better service to the residents of the town. That's kind of what my question is. And I'm going back to the points about all the people in town who are very happy with the service that we've had over the years. There aren't that many complaints. There have been complaints on HR issues and some behavioral issues. But it seems to me that you get a lot of bang for the buck by doing appropriate training within the department we have in order to get those people the proper skill set rather than going outside to people who I do think won't know our town as well as as our current officers do. I'm sensitive to the issue about salaries, and what question I have about that is that it sounds like the package that we're offering does not match the people we're trying to attract. We need to give them more money in pocket. And the question I have is whether we can reduce on the benefits side of it in order to make it an attractive package for the people we're trying to get, people in their 20s and 30s who are looking for money on the table as opposed to thinking about the 12% contribution to their retirement program.
That's a good negotiating stance. So first of all 3 of those models can work. I just want to say that. And I don't think we have enough data now. You've got analysis, but you don't have enough data. You've got to test the market. So most agencies, certainly in California, are negotiating fringe benefits. Whether they're higher than yours, the same or lower, they're all negotiating it. The corresponding side of that is in negotiations, something's got to give, and it is usually salaries. But the problem with many fringe benefits, especially retirement, which is so expensive in California, is that you are encumbering future generations with a large cost that's not entirely funded now. So they're all trying to get control over that. So yes, you could do that strategy as well. And that would, maybe you get the 25% or some other number. Don't want to do your negotiations for you. But maybe bring the fringe benefit level down. And you'd be in concert with most of California.
Please keep your hand up after this gentleman if you have not yet asked a question. We'll get to the second round after those.
Right. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering if you have any examples of the full-service contract beat model that exists elsewhere in California, or if not in California, in other states that you've worked with police departments. I think it would be instructional if the board, for example, was looking at the various options, that they could look at case studies of the beat model.
So I just want to make sure I understand what you mean by the beat model. You mean where the service is extended from another community?
The model that you've put forward.
Okay.
Okay, that model. I call it a beat model, but whatever you want to call it, it's the model that you've recommended.
Oh, well, apart from how they build up the formula, that is exactly the way agencies in Orange County Sheriff's Office, Riverside County Sheriff's Office, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office, and LA County Sheriff's Office all contract in something like that. Okay. It's either on service hours or on a fixed level of service.
Now, how has that worked out? Have there been any complaints, or?
Sure.
And what would they be?
We're paying too much for not the service we contracted for, what any contract situation is. But they're all staying. Huh?
But that's a different model, though. The model that she mentioned, the Orinda, which you're very familiar with, obviously, Lafayette, Orinda, Danville, are different models than what you're proposing here. They have
really, they build it up on a level of service.
Right, but it's much more service than what you'd be proposing here.
For a variety of reasons, they have the money to be able to pay for a higher level of service. Yeah, and they're bigger. That's true, but about 10 years ago, that's exactly what we said.
This is a question for Tony, our general manager. Tony, a lot of this is academic without getting the money. So where you sit and stand over these issues, assume no tax increase in the next couple of years, where are you going to find money to do even the first few high priority items? Where's the money? Especially with all of our competing costs, if you take reserves out for this building, where does the money come from? What's our pocketbook look like?
Well, you may have come in a few minutes late to the meeting, but I had indicated that I would have the option of not answering one question, so this is the question I choose not to answer. That's a hard question to answer, and I don't have a ready answer for you. I think it's something that we really need to look at very closely. There's some potential of savings in the ideas that have been brought forward. I'd like to review that potential, like, for example, the night shift was one that was indicated. I don't know if that would be acceptable to the community, though. So there's the potential of some items, by saving some areas, we could apply it in other areas. It seems to me that the hybrid has some potential, not a general hybrid on 20 services, but a few services that we need to look at a little more closely.
My apologies. So far, you've talked about shifting monies, which any executive would look at, but let's go back to the real question, which is, at some point, am I correct in assuming that there isn't an extra $700,000 in next year's budget? Can we agree to that assumption?
We can agree.
Okay, so assuming that that's true, and you're done shifting costs, outsourcing certain things, what have you, what's on the horizon as you look at it in terms of money? How much money, where are you going to get any money? Is there 100,000 out there? Give us a sense of how far are we away from these hypothetical models or choices.
There's many different variations of these, so it's hard to pinpoint one. Most of what I've been looking at is shifting. There isn't any real source of money out there. The only other possibility would be to go to the voters and ask for an increase in the assessments. So unless there's some other approach that's creative that people would like to review.
What you just said essentially is really, in fact, on the ground, what you and the board are going to look at. What you really just said is, thank you, what you've really just said is that you and the board are somehow, you've got to work with reality, and you're going to do the no-cost, low-cost transfer things first, and then see where you are. That's what it sounds like.
We do have to work with reality. I think I would quickly agree with that. In the end, it really is a board decision. The board, the manager, my role is to make a recommendation.
It's all of our decision, isn't it?
But the board, in the end, the board decides how this should be, how we should go forward.
Hopefully they will give us a chance to vote. We've been asking for a vote, or at least a survey question that asks what the community says, rather than simply a survey saying, do we like the police or not, and then a comment that you believe 30% of the community is for contracting out, 30% of the community is for a local police, and 30% haven't made their mind up. I don't believe that's a true statement, and I think that a lot of the data you're presenting is pushing an issue that shouldn't be pushed. I think if you had taken your data and used it right, you would be making recommendation one, not spending more money. I want to say one thing that prompted me to talk right now, and that is we keep talking about not having services in the middle of the night, because if we have a contractor, we would end up having him come for that specific call. Well, every night at 1 in the morning and at 4 in the morning, there is a cop car who comes around our neighborhood. One day, a few weeks ago, we left our hood came up, and the cop stopped and asked us, was our house all right? Now, how would you do that if you don't have police wandering around the neighborhood at night?
Thank you for your comment.
With respect to questions, if you haven't asked one yet, please keep your hand up.
This may have been brought up at the other meeting, but I'm just curious on the one-to-one supervisor to staff compared to other occupations. That's quite an unusual number. Or is this actually a career ladder? And my second question is, shouldn't there be patrols at night?
Yeah, there certainly would be patrols at night. And our analysis of the alternatives is you have your own patrols at night or you contract for patrols at night. So your first question about first line supervision. Yeah, that's a pretty narrow span of control for a supervisor, but that's how important first line supervision is in any industry. But today, when so much is expected of law enforcement in terms of being ethical models, in terms of being involved with the community, in terms of all the laws and services that they're responsible for dealing with people with, supervision is critical.
All right, other questions? We have about 19 minutes left, so this would be a second round unless this gentleman has not asked a question, if I remember correctly.
My kind of question is that eventually it really comes down to if we're going to pay for anything more, it's going to come out of the taxes. We'll have to go for a tax increase. And my question is, I don't really know what our current tax situation is, how much we're each paying for the police services, and then how much more we would have to pay to implement $700,000 more expenses.
If you did it as a parcel tax basis, as a different kind of assessment, it would be about $300 or $400 a parcel. If you just use that method, yes.
Yeah, for going up, raising $700,000 or $800,000.
Correct. So, yeah.
I just want to ask a question about if we had to raise our taxes, it would be more, so I understand this properly, that we would all be taxed at the same amount as opposed to a percentage of what we're paying now?
Well, in California, you can't do anything with the assessed value or the 1% of the assessed valuation. But for special purposes, and public safety gets some special attention here, you're allowed to do things like a parcel tax. But that would mean that it's not on an ad valorem basis, not based on the value of your house, but every parcel would pay the same amount.
So has everybody that has their hand up, are you on your second round? Is there anyone that hasn't asked a question yet that wants to? All right.
I really wanted to answer the second question that was asked tonight about disasters. During a disaster, our police and our fire department, if it's a major disaster, an earthquake or something, they're not going to be able to get around. We have what's called CERTs, and this is people that are trained to help out during a disaster. Everybody at Kensington should go and take the CERT training and to learn how to help your neighbors during a major disaster. Also, there was something about PERS. I'm a PERS retiree, and for the bang for the buck through PERS, you can't compare it with any other system. It is really, really great. I didn't get an answer to my original question. Was if the board decides to go out and outsource our police department, would they please put it up to vote for the people before doing that? And that question never got answered.
That's a choice for the board to make.
All right, sir.
Okay, you have an understanding what our police department is like. You have met with the board. You have seen the community, and you have a basic idea of our financial issues. Why don't you make a recommendation? You know that our board is not long on management experience. Why don't you come right out and you say, this is what you ought to do with the amount of money you have. You have more experience than anyone else with police departments. Why don't you come and say, this is what you should do?
In terms of the example you gave about management, that's quite clear in the report, and we've laid out a number of management principles that your chief should possess or have. And thank you. And that's for the general manager and the board to work with the chief to make sure that any chief was doing what a manager should do in the police department. Why am I doing this? No, I don't know.
Okay?
Did I get an answer?
Yeah. Yeah, it's in the report. The management principles that your chief or any chief should be evaluated by are those best practices in the Phase 1 report.
I don't know if this is in your report or not, because I had to read it rather quickly. What is the impact of CalPERS with the various options, i.e., if we went with a full board contract, wouldn't we get hit pretty hard with CalPERS? If we went with a hybrid, and we had somebody in, wouldn't their CalPERS contribution be inherently part of their contracting out rate? And wouldn't we still be responsible for our own CalPERS at the same time? And isn't this really a killer?
Depends on how you do it. Greg's
Money-wise, I mean, if we don't have enough money to make these $700,000 improvements, do we have enough money to do the CalPERS number?
The CalPERS number is in that figure of both the 700,000 and the 858,000.
As
And the
terminating?
other one, yes, it's not terminating. It's based on an inactive status in CalPERS as opposed to an active status. Now, if you went to a hybrid model where you had both staff in-house as well as contract, then you could remain active, and your annual fees for the unfunded liability would be reduced compared to the model that we developed, the full contract services model. But the whole CalPERS things is very complex. The numbers were built into the models that were in the report, and I would suggest that you reference it because it is, as you're pointing out, pretty sophisticated.
And
it's referenced in your bulletin, but the details are in the report.
And is it a continuing obligation?
CalPERS will be a continuing obligation for you for anywhere from 15 to 30 years, even if you went on a full contract basis to fund that unfunded liability. Yes.
So you had mentioned, Richard, a little bit earlier that many localities in California are using non-sworn folks. They're training them. They're really engaging the community. Coming out of the medical field, I've seen a great deal of this done to tremendous effect in keeping the community engaged and keeping costs down. And yet, in no instance that I know of have you talked about that as one of the models.
It's just way too small a community to effectively civilianize. So if, for example, we're talking about the field recommendation about how important it is to have 2 people out there, is one of them a civilian? No, because a civilian couldn't help out the sworn person when that person was needed. So you're just too small. I mean, certainly for support types of things, because there's not much administrative support within the district, that's why we've made that recommendation. And I don't know why it's doing this. I'm going to move. Glad it's not my watch.
Further questions? This gentleman here.
Is the general manager, has he left?
I don't know.
No, he's around the corner. Tony. Well, we're losing our audience here, so let's have another couple of questions and then wrap it up.
My question is that, question, he said that we could get $700,000 with a $300 per parcel tax increase. How difficult do you think it would be in Kensington to get a $300 per parcel increase?
I think parcel increases are very difficult in all communities.
Okay, one more question. One question I have is, you were talking about the officers had a great deal of time to do traffic or anything. You told me the last meeting that you based your numbers on 6 months of data under our new report writing system. And I told you then that we did not get adequate training in that system. We also, at that point, we're not doing a lot of calls over the computers like we used to, a lot of our traffic stops, and a lot of stuff. So the data was way off. And I told you that at the time, and you guys haven't revised your data at all. You haven't looked at our newer, like given another year worth of data. You didn't look at our old data, and I told you to do that. You also had 3 different people come into our department asking different employees different things, and then you're putting a report together based on that, saying that you have all this data, when in reality, you guys didn't put a lot of data together. 6 months is not going to tell us what's going on around here. Plus 6 months of barely using the computers, not knowing how to use them, not having adequate reporting, all that.
Well, there were some, we can talk about this later, but there were some definitional issues between what some people in the department felt and our data. There was a feeling that much of what we're calling self-initiated activity, you consider to be a call for service, and our models work differently. So secondly, we landed in the situation that we did, and you had data issues, and you were changing your dispatch function not long before that. So we had 6 months of good data. We did check it with 6 weeks later on, but we only could deal with the data that we had at the time. I'm not surprised by the data. I'm not surprised that for a department in serving a community like this that you've got 60 or 70 or so % proactive time. That's not uncommon for small communities.
Well,
The issue, what?
You were saying that we had 90%.
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised by that either. The issue is what you're doing with that substantial amount of time. And I disagree. I don't think that one of the high priority hybrid things would be to contract for somebody with traffic enforcement. If you've got 90% proactive time, that's got to be a key proactive emphasis within the department.
You also.
Listen, we don't want to, this is the purpose of this, not to have a debate.
I'm asking a question.
I wanted to thank all the residents for coming here. We're going to stay after the meeting for a few minutes if you'd like to talk to us, and we'd like to adjourn the meeting. Thanks, everybody.
There you go. Good job, Tony.